Welcome to Inside the Castle, the podcast that goes behind castle doors to have real conversations with real people about solving the nation's toughest challenges. I'm one of your hosts today, Aaron Snyder.
And I'm Angie Fryerman.
Today we're continuing our three-part miniseries on the 200-year history of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works. And this is the second episode, and today we'll be focusing on the early USACE surveys and civil works projects from 1824 to 1865. With us today is Matt Piercy, John Lonnquest, and Jonah B. Taylor. Thank you all for joining us here today.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so before we jump into this second part of the series, for some of our listeners that maybe didn't listen to the first episode, could each of you just give us a little background on yourself and why you're passionate about history?
This is John Lonnquest. Yeah, I was that kid who always knew he wanted to be a historian. I didn't know quite what being a historian was, though, so it took me a while to figure it out. I was a history major as an undergraduate, then went to Duke University for my graduate work. I've been an Army historian for close to 30 years. I think one of the appeals of this early period is we can see civil works really coming together. We see the nation's needs, which are pretty clear, and then we see politicians and the Corps of Engineers working together to try to see how we can meet those needs, and then also the emerging tools, technology, and science that facilitated that mission over the next 200 years.
Thanks. Matt, you want to go next?
My name is Matt Piercy. I am a historian here in the Office of History, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I've been a historian with the Army for coming up on 23, 24 years now. I joined in 2001, the St. Paul district, and worked as a district historian for 5 years before taking a job out here at headquarters in 2006. My dissertation was a history of the Mississippi River Commission, which is a federal agency that oversees flood control and coordination with the Corps of Engineers, and now underneath the Corps of Engineers. And so river history is a natural for me. I'm a civil works historian here in the office. Excited to get a chance to talk a little bit about the General Survey Act and the origins of our internal improvements program.
Hi, I'm Jonah B. Taylor. I'm a historian also in Office of History headquarters, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm kind of the young person in the office. I've only been here coming up on 7 years now. I studied history for my PhD at Georgia Tech in the history of technology, and I had studied a number of other things before that. Have a master's degree in organizational and social psychology, but history was just so exciting because of the stories and understanding how things changed over time. I actually wrote about Corps of Engineers flood control projects, as they were called back then, in the Southeast, kind of in the mid-20th century. So that's what I wrote about for my dissertation. And I thought it was just such an exciting way to see both how the nation changed and how cities grew, and looking at those projects, part of that larger context was what made me most excited.
So, John, can you talk to us about some of the first civil works projects and why they mattered?
Sure, I think it's important to go back and sort of see what the United States looked like in 1824. So remember that merchants, farmers, politicians, and engineers all acknowledged that the early republic desperately needed secure and reliable inland transportation to both facilitate commerce and to secure national defense. And many saw America's river system as a solution. Example of that is in 1847, Congressman John Spencer described the nation's river system as a boundless hydrographic system, binding the nation and the states together. At the same time, the United States was growing rapidly. The population of the Mississippi River Valley exploded from 500,000 in 1800 to 4 million people 3 decades later. Most were farmers, and all needed a way to get their crops to market. But America's river networks often did not accommodate inland navigation. Low flows in the summer and floods in winter and spring halted navigation. A variety of obstructions, including snags and rafts, slowed commerce, making riverine transportation dangerous and unpredictable. For example, in 1839, 21 vessels on inland rivers were sunk by snags, and millions of dollars of perishable commodities were laws getting to market. The Corps of Engineers' first civil works project, building a wing dam on the Ohio River, began in the summer of 1824. Congress in the western states soon took notice of the Corps' river work, and the program quickly expanded. Recognizing the value of inland navigation in the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1826, Congress appropriated $3 million for civil works at 22 project sites scattered across 10 states. Between 1827 and 1841, vigorous new methods of clearing riverine obstructions, primarily snagging and dredging, quickly cleared many of the worst snags and rafts on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Transportation costs decreased and commerce grew rapidly.
I'm continuously interested in really why the Army Corps of Engineers was the one selected to do this mission for the nation. It seems to me like, today you think about, surveying and maybe dredging and snagging, and that's definitely something the private sector could handle. Why was it that the Army engineers were the ones that were chosen to do this? And did they have the necessary experience or training or to actually successfully carry out this mission?
On the education and training, the answer is yes and no. When established in 1802, West Point was the nation's first engineering school, and many of its instructors were French engineers who imparted their engineering practice, thorough study augmented by rigorous math-based curriculum, to engineer education. West Point cadets and officers also traveled to Europe to study hydrology and see firsthand how the countries they were beginning to manage their river systems. And the American engineers enthusiastically embraced what they saw and learned. Writing in 1842, Army engineer George Hughes observed that if builders first try to understand stream behavior, then water, and indeed all of nature, would dance to the genius of man. Hughes's pronouncement provided overly optimistic, for initially Army engineers lacked both the theoretical and practical tools to manage rivers and watersheds. And embattled shippers on America's rivers couldn't wait. However, by the mid-1820s, Army engineers embraced more expedient methods, notably snagging and dredging, to clear the worst of the obstructions. They learned on the fly. So, to your second question, why this mission was given to Army engineers, it's pretty clear. The Army was one of the nation's only organizations with a nationwide footprint. It also had the logistics, financial, and management capabilities enable those West Point trained engineers to apply their skills all over the country. So it's a combination of West Point education with Army systems management that made the engineers effective and resulted in them getting the Civil Works mission in 1824.
So did the Army engineers have the appropriate tools to accomplish this new mission? And what kinds of new technologies did they use?
Those technologies were rapidly emerging at the beginning of the 19th century. Notably, high-pressure steam engines coupled with durable, shallow draft hulls gave engineers stable platforms to explore Western rivers and later clear them. The snag boat, developed in the 1820s and perfected under the colorful Captain Henry Shreve, was a major step forward. Shreve used the unorthodox-looking twin-hull vessels as marine battering rams. He would ram a snag. Remember, a snag is that complete tree that has probably fallen from the bank. The root ball is lodged in the bed of the river, and it floats up at a 45-degree angle, waiting to impale passing maritime traffic. So Shreve would ram a snag, winch it aboard with that powerful steam engine, cut it apart, and then move on to the next obstruction. So with those trees, sometimes he would literally cut them apart. Part of them went in the boiler to fuel his operations, and part of them went over the side. Within a decade, Shreve had half a dozen snag boats and hundreds of men working to clear hazards on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The use of dredging, especially when combined with steam power, also proved effective before the Civil War. Blasting obstructions, notably underwater ones, was limited by the relatively low yield of black powder. Other powerful tools, namely the introduction of cement and steel, were on the horizon by the end of the Civil War.
It's interesting to think about the different types of tools and technology you had at the time, particular compared to what we have today, and really remembering what those starting points are. But it kind of makes me wonder, like going back to the beginning of the Corps of Engineers, was it always really the Corps of Engineers that had this mission, or were there different components that came together? I'm just trying to understand how this worked when you're looking at, the education from West Point and the various missions. How did it all come under the current umbrella?
So I think what I'll restrict my comments to civil works. So what we have is a combination of a national need, i.e. that we need secure commercial and military transportation. We have a difficult system-wide problem, i.e. that many of America's rivers are clogged with snags and rafts are huge mats, many lasting for miles, of timber that blocks the riverway. So we had a big problem, and what we needed were trained engineers. Army had the only ones available, and then we could couple those engineers with the nationwide administrative capabilities of the Army and the Corps of Engineers. And then also there was a relationship with Congress. Congress trusted the Corps of Engineers to execute those projects, to get labor where they needed it, to purchase the necessary supplies, and administer the funds.
So I'm curious, did the Army engineers have the administrative capabilities to carry out internal improvements? And how did early civil works differ from the Corps' proven capability to build coastal fortifications?
Great question. Army engineers did have the administrative capability they needed, but it was really a case of learning as they went. For example, the Corps' first civil works project under Stephen Long is a case in point. In the summer of 1824, Long arrived in Pittsburgh, built flatboats to house his workmen and serve as a base of operation, and then he floated down the Ohio River to Wheeling, West Virginia. Using hired labor, he built a wing dam, box-like structure between two parallel rows of piles and filled with stone and brush. The wing dam was designed to narrow the channel, increase the flow of the river, and then clear a troublesome sandbar where only provided 15 inches of water over the sandbar. Long and his workmen were unable to finish the job that year, so they wintered at nearby Steubenville and returned the following spring to finish the job. Currently, we're used to the Corps having a nationwide civil works footprint. We have engineer divisions and engineer districts. It was far different in the early days of the program. Between 1824 and 1840, work on the Ohio River was performed by engineer offices in Louisville and Cincinnati that comprised the Corps of Engineers Office of Western Improvement, and it was led by Colonel Stephen Long and Captain Henry Shreve. Their offices were sparse. In 1852, engineers in Louisville, for example, operated out of a 4-room office. Colonel Long worked in one, his deputy, Captain John Russell, in another. 2 clerks worked in third, and a 4th served as a drafting and map preparation room. But the Corps' Civil Works program grew steadily after the Civil War, up until the Civil War. After 50 years of diligent application, the Corps had learned to combine hydrographic research with practical engineering, survey major river systems, identify hazards, propose projects, and supervise construction. Approximately 70 West Point trained engineers, augmented by a growing cadre of civilian engineers, had learned their lessons well. So the big contrast between civil works and coastal fortifications is that in civil works, the sites changed daily, weekly, or monthly. So we had engineer officers venturing out into the hinterlands, establishing offices, hiring workmen, purchasing supplies, and doing work. They would then finish that project and move on to another. Coastal fortifications, in contrast, took years to complete. So we had the same sort of project organization, but it didn't move nearly as rapidly and usually was closer to major cities.
That's an interesting history. And it's interesting to hear that, you'd have these Army engineers that go out and form offices, get people to do the work, and then kind of to move to the next project. Thinking of this as from like the federal perspective, you got the federal government going out there and saying, I'm going to fix this problem. I'm curious, how did they interact with the locals? Was there a local component to these projects, or was this really just federally led and driven? And then also, like, how did they carry these out? I know you said that they hired people, but were there contractors back in the day that helped carry these things out, or were these carried out by the use of additional Army engineers or federal resources?
I think first nationally, the passage of the first several Rivers and Harbors Act thrust the Corps of Engineers right into the hurly-burly world of American politics, right? Because we had, as my colleague Matt Piercy said in a previous episode of your podcast, that we had significant congressional competition between what projects would be built in their respective areas of operation, that congressional districts competing with each other for resources. So the Corps of Engineers had to learn to manage that process, and they did over time. Second, what did a Corps of Engineers project look like when that young officer arrived at a project site? Well, in contrast to today, where the Corps does the vast majority of its work through contracts, back in the early 19th century, the Corps worked primarily through what they called labor hire. So the idea is that Corps of Engineer officer would arrive in town, he'd rent office space, he'd hire some local workmen, probably a messenger, probably a boatman, and then he would ascertain what needed to be built, and then he would hire local workmen, he would purchase supplies, and he would rent equipment. The idea there being that the engineer officer in charge acted as his own general contractor. That was, at the time, somewhat controversial, i.e. that sometimes local interests, local construction companies felt that they were being minimized, but the labor hire system lasted until the early 1930s.
Thanks, John. I think I just have really one last question here for you before we're out of time. I know we talked in our first podcast on the series about the origins of the USACE Civil Works, and it's really obvious to me the importance of that period of time where the Corps was obviously the initial legislation to create the Corps of Engineers, pretty exciting. Could you tell our listeners, why do you think that this period is so important for the development of the Corps of Engineers from your perspective? So this period that we're talking about from 1824 to 1865?
Sure. And I think that's an excellent background question. So the idea here is that we're having sort of the collision, as we could say, of major national interests, right? So we have Western states wanting rivers cleared for commerce. We have Eastern states that aren't terribly happy with that concept. And then we have a number of very important congressional actions, the Rivers and Harbors Act 1824. We have Supreme Court cases, Gibbons versus Ogden, which you mentioned earlier, and my colleague Matt Piercy did too. So all of these threads to come together, we passed the enabling legislation in 1824. We passed the subsequent Rivers and Harbors Act. So what we see up until the Civil War is that very new process taking shape. We see a trial and error process. We see Army engineers learning what works and what doesn't work. We see local interests lobbying Congress, who then come to the Corps of Engineers and ask them to build new things or build different kinds of things. So this is a really vibrant yet somewhat turbulent era of the Corps' history. And what it gets us to is that by the end of the Civil War, we have a civil works process that's well in place. And now we're looking for a new political consensus after the war to expand the Civil Works project.
No, that's really helpful. I almost see it like as, the first podcast we talked about is kind of like the beginning of life. You're born, you're kind of a kid in that, and then this middle period is your teenage years, trying to figure things out and development. While when we go to the post-Civil War in our next episode, which we'll cover from 1865 up through today, where we are more in our adult phase of life. So thank you, Matt, John, and Jonah, for joining us here today for this edition of Inside the Castle. We appreciate you and your insights. Until next time, be safe, be innovative, and remember your history.
Thanks for joining us for this Inside the Castle podcast. To provide your feedback, email us at cw.infrastructure.team@usace.army.mil. Stay tuned for additional Inside the Castle podcasts as we explore life inside the Corps and revolutionize civil works together.